where slavery was the foundation of a globally dominant cotton economy. But while a majority of Forsyth's earlier settlers owned no slaves, there was a sizable minority who did. And when they crossed the Chattahoochee in 1839 and entered the former Cherokee territory, they brought with them a population of enslaved black men and women whose labor would be vital to carving out a living in the wild, isolated hills. The largest slaveholders were the Stricklands. You know, Strickland is pervasive in Costco. That name just being everywhere is very pervasive in Costco. Strickland. Anyways, let's go. The largest slaveholders, impoverished, well, I won't say impoverished, but they call them the hillbilly wealth, you know, the hillbilly rich folk. Strickland, whose patriarch Hardy Sr. had come into the county with the first wave of land lottery winners. All right, he won the lottery, okay? Got some land. In 1832, and had quickly established some of Forsyth's most productive gold mines. In 1840, he owned 7 slaves. A decade later, that number had grown to 17. By 1860, Hardy's 4 sons, Hardy Jr., Tolbert, Joel, and Jacob, were the owners of a group of slaves that had now swelled to 113, and they used that massive supply of unpaid labor to grow rich from the bounty of Strickland mines and Strickland plantations, which were among the county's largest producers of corn, wheat, and oat. Interesting. The last slave census before emancipation showed that Forsyth was home to a total of 890 enslaved people and nearly 200 different slave-owning families, representing 15% of all households. No one else in Forsyth owned slaves on the same scale as the Stricklands, but there were numerous other white men whose farms, mines, and household depended on enslaved workers. Yeah, sounds about right. Most prominent among them were David and Martin Graham, S.W. Clement, and John Bailey, each of whom owned more than 30 slaves. This might be some of these politicians, you know, kinfolk, the Kamala Harrises, you know what I'm saying? The Elizabeth Warrens. You gotta look into some of these people's history. You know, the Clintons, the Nixon. Might be some kinfolk, okay? The men and women Hardy Sr. brought into the hills were listed in the 1840 and 1850 slave schedules as black. But by 1860, more than 21 of the 113 Strickland slaves were recorded by the census taker as mulatto or mixed race. Such distinctions based on skin color were not, of course, scientific, like most of the knowledge that we have in America. The climate theory was one of the wildest theories that has ever existed, which, if I'm not mistaken, it stemmed from Carl Linnaeus with a blend of Voltaire and some stemming to Greek, Greek mythology. But the climate theory, which basically stated that black people, were dark skinned because of they lived in very hot climates. And when you live in these extreme hot climates, it makes you barbaric, demonic, ungovernable. What was the other things that it was a bunch of wild stuff. But the other end of the spectrum also applied. So when it came to the extremes of like the pasties, the white folks that come from the extremely cold climates, they were viewed just as ignorant, ungovernable, barbaric as motherfucking black people. It's interesting. But yes, the climate theory was something that was being pushed around as science, a scientific theory, which was later refuted and found to be hogwash. It's crazy. Anyways, let's continue. Such distinctions based on skin color were not, of course, scientific, like most of the stuff back then. And currently, nevertheless, that shift in the way that the census takers viewed the growing population of Strickland slaves raises the possibility that some of the exponential growth in the size of the slave community on Strickland farms was due to the rape of African American women by the family's white patriarchs, which we've seen that time and time again. I mean, they talking about these people came into like slave ownership around, they won the land lottery 1832, and by 1840 owned 7 slaves. By 1860 they were up to 113, and we know from history slavery ended shortly after. So how do they maintain their wealth? Well, you can't bring in more slaves. And remind you, the Elizabeth Key case, there was a young lady from Georgia, Virginia. I don't remember at the time that this occurred, but she sued in court. I want to say it was about about mid to late 1800s. But this young lady, and it was before slavery ended, obviously. But this lady, Elizabeth Keys, she was born to a white woman and a white daddy. That white daddy is the Christian, right? She has sued for her freedom because she's like, not only is she white, her daddy white, but her daddy was a Christian. And by their laws, legislation, it said that basically they prohibit the enslavement of Christians, which is why black people for the longest were not even viewed as Christians. So that's why I think it's crazy that you got a lot of black people they hate Jesus for some crazy stuff that some hateful white people did in the past. It's like, baby, Jesus ain't had squat to do with that, in the sense of that's not what he was, you know what I'm saying? Like, Jesus ain't trying to make you subservient to, you ain't subservient to nobody but him. You know what I'm saying? Jesus, but they mad at Jesus, talking about, all the wild stuff they say, overlooking the fact that black people weren't even viewed as Christians, because if we were, then technically by law, we couldn't have been enslaved. But we were. So this lady, she sued for her freedom and she won. And she won because they're like, you know what? You're right. Your daddy's white. We had passed it in the law that Christians cannot be enslaved. And you prove that you are the descendant of a white Christian. So you take the status of your dad, that white Christian, and she won her freedom. And shortly after that, that's when the legislation motherfucking changed again. They was like, you know what? We got to change the laws, because now we're going to have a bunch of white people. We're going to have a bunch of mulattoes trying to sue for their freedom. And that's going to hurt our pockets, because now we're going to have a great portion of our slave force displacing themselves based on this law that we passed that says that, if you could take the status of your parent, which we prohibited the enslavement of Christians. And so what they did was change the status. They changed the law, right, as it pertained to intimate relations, but they also changed the status of the child. So now, where she sued, basing it on the status of her daddy, the child status is acquired from the mama. So it don't matter who your mama is, right? You get your mama status. But this is how they made sure that they prohibited white women, their offspring, from suing for their freedom. That is, they also passed laws that prohibited the sexual mixing of anybody but white men. White men were the only ones that were allowed to sleep outside of their race. White women were only stuck with white women. So this is how they prohibited people from suing for their freedom, basing it on the status of their parent. They said, we're gonna attach solely the status to mothers, so we white men can rape and wreak havoc on these black women, and they can't sue it trying to attach themselves to our status. You gain your mama status, right? So you born to a black woman, a slave woman, you are a slave, right? In addition to that, we're going to prevent you from taking the status of a potential white mama by prohibiting white women from sleeping with anyone outside of white men. So this is how they began to make it possible for white men to just wreak havoc and rape on people and increase their slave force, which we see that's what was presumed here, where it says that, nevertheless, that shift in the way the census takers view the growing population of Strickland slaves raises the possibility that some of the exponential growth in the size of the slave community on Strickland farms was due to rape of African American women by the families of those white patriarchs. Even today, descendants of the Strickland slaves tell family stories about light-skinned ancestors who spoke openly of having been fathered by their white owners. At least one former Georgia slave made it clear to a white listener that plantations like the Strickland farm did not fill up with mulatto babies by chance. "Why is my husband, George, so white?" Carrie Mason asked a Federal Writers Project interviewer in 1937, going on to answer her own question. "'Cause his master's was a white gentleman." Now, I'm going to show y'all. I might sound like I'm butchering this a bit. Let me get it back in the camera. This is where I'm reading right here, this little section. And you see, "'cause his master was a white gentleman." So if I start reading all butchered sounding, it's because I'm trying to read in their dialect, you know what I'm saying? "'Cause his master was a white gentleman named Mr. Jimmy Dunn. His mammy was a colored woman named Frances Mason, and his master was his pa. Yes, ma'am, I see you is surprised, but that happened a lot in them days. I heard tell of a white man what would tell his sons to go down to them nigger quarters and get me more slaves."